In my opinion, the CX-9 is quite simply one of the most beautiful three-row crossovers you can buy in America, regardless of price. But is this 2019 CX-9 more than just a pretty face? That's what we're here to find out. The last time I drove the CX-9 was back in 2016 when Mazda first launched this generation of their three-row crossover. Three-row crossovers are huge business in America, and that's why we see so many new models lately and complete redesigns and refreshes of existing models. For 2020, Ford is giving us an all-new Explorer. It's going rear-wheel drive. We have the brand new family-focused Volkswagen Atlas and two of the biggest crossovers that Korea has ever produced. So in this video, we're going to ask the important question, is the CX-9 more than just a pretty face? Does it have what it takes to compete in this segment with all of these new options? Well, talking about the pretty face first, I have to say it is, again, very, very attractive. I love the overall style, and I love how minimalist it actually is compared to some of the other options. The headlights are exactly where you expect them. They're not located down somewhere strange on the front bumper. We have this large chrome grille right here. We have a large Mazda logo, which hides the radar sensor, and then fog lamps down below. My only real complaint up front is that the parking sensors could be a little bit better integrated. The CX-9 isn't just pretty from the front, it's also pretty from the side, and I think most of that has to do with this long hood proportion. You can really see how long the hood is in this, especially when you compare this to something like a Honda Pilot or a Toyota Highlander. The reason for this long hood proportion is the way that Mazda has designed their engines and their exhaust systems in their modern vehicles, and that results in this long hood profile. They've also done it a little bit deliberately right here to make it look more attractive. So you can see that this bit right here is really just used up in the pretty work to help elongate the nose. The effect of this is that at 199.4 inches long, this is one of the longest entries in this group. It actually is only a little bit shorter than a Durango or a Traverse and is notably longer than the new Kia or the Hyundai. But because of the way the space has been utilized, we actually find interior room that's a little bit closer to something like a Honda Pilot or a Toyota Highlander than the larger entries in this segment. This is the same overall trade-off that we also see in the Dodge Durango. It has a long hood as well and interior dimensions that are a little bit more similar to some of the smaller entries in the group, but the long hood proportion helps both of them look a little bit different than the average. Out back, we have distinctive tail lamp modules with a strong chrome bar connecting the two that mimics the style going on up front. The overall style of the rear end is again definitely reserved versus some of the other entries in this segment, and it actually reminds me a little bit of what Infiniti might do if they were making a new three-row crossover today. That's not a bad thing to be reminded of when you're paying considerably less for a mainstream crossover. Now, one thing that I will mention back here is that there are a lot of curves and a lot of areas in here that are a little bit difficult to clean. Here at Alex and Autos, I always wash the cars before we film them, and this was a little bit of a bear to really get in all those crevices to keep clean. Mazda was one of the first mainstream brands to make some of their latest active safety technologies available in even their less expensive models and less expensive trims. For 2019, we don't find their latest suite standard in the CX-9, but we do find a reasonable number of their options standard. All trims of the CX-9 will have low-speed autonomous braking, blind spot monitoring, and cross-traffic detection, in addition to the standard LED headlamps that we see up front. If you work your way on up the ladder, then we get the higher speed auto braking system with radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, and steering headlamps. That's a little bit different than the Toyota Highlander, which has radar adaptive cruise control in even the base trim. Of course, in my opinion, one of the most interesting safety features on the CX-9 is found right here in the wheel wells, because we have standard 18-inch 255 width tires on all trims of the CX-9. These are very wide tires, not just for the mainstream crossover segment, but also the luxury crossover segment. 255 width tires are not even standard on something like a Volvo XC90, but you'll find them on all trims of the CX-9. Now, admittedly, the particular tire on this car is an Ecopia tire, which is an eco-focused tire, but because this vehicle was designed for this size tire to be on all trims, it'd be very easy to swap these out with summer tires and get even better handling. Under the hood, we find just one engine on offer for 2019. It's a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. It produces 227 horsepower on regular unleaded, 250 if you choose to feed it premium. Regardless of the fuel you choose, torque remains the same at 310 pound-feet, which is definitely stout for this particular segment. Power is routed to either the front wheels or to all four wheels via a standard 6-speed automatic transmission. This 6-speed auto is a few gears behind the competition, and as we'll discuss in the drive section, that does show out on the road. Fuel economy, however, is definitely good for this group at 23 miles per gallon in the model we're driving, which is the all-wheel drive trim, 24 if you choose front-wheel drive. In terms of comparisons, that puts this above the Ford Explorer with the 2.3-liter turbo. That would be the 2019 model. The Honda Pilot with the 6-speed automatic transmission is definitely going to be lower than this, and even the new Kia Telluride and Hyundai Palisade actually get about 1 mile per gallon less than the CX-9. I'm going to give the trim we're driving, which is the Grand Touring trim, 8 out of 10 points when it comes to our front seat comfort index. We have a two-way adjustable lumbar support for the driver and the front passenger, which is a nice touch. The passenger seat moves in exactly the same way as the driver's seat, but this seat is overall not as adjustable as some of the competition. For instance, we don't have an extending thigh cushion like you will find in some alternatives, or a four-way adjustable lumbar support. We do have a tilt telescopic steering column, however, with a decent range of motion. Hopping into the second row, you'll notice what I meant earlier about the CX-9 not having quite the same kind of interior space as some of the larger alternatives in this segment. Overall combined legroom, as you'll see on the chart on the side, comes in at 110.1 inches, which is about 5 less than we find in the Pathfinder and about 8 inches less than we find in the new Telluride and Palisade. But that overall combined legroom figure doesn't affect the second row quite as much as you might think. It actually mainly affects the third row, which we're going to look at in a bit. The second row, I still have several inches of legroom left with this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. And we have a 7-seat configuration here. The middle seat still has just about enough headroom, about half an inch left right here in the middle for an adult to sit upright. And then scooting all the way over to the right side with the front seat all the way back in its tracks, I have about 2.5 inches of legroom left. In addition to the overall legroom being a little bit lower in the CX-9 than some of the competition, you will notice that overall headroom is also a little bit lower. Although that doesn't really bother me at my height, I still have about 2 inches left over here, but the headroom is a little bit lower right here on the side, so if you do tend to lean over, you might bop your head on the sill. If you routinely have child seats in the second row of your 3-row crossover, then you'll be happy to know that you can actually leave a forward-facing child seat latched into place and still access the third row, but only over here on the 40% side. On the 60% side, the seat does not move in the same manner. Although it's still a little bit tight to get back into the third row, it's an awful lot easier with the seat in this position than it would be over there on the other side of the car. Hopping into the third row, I'm going to give these seats 7 out of 10 points. With this second row seat slid all the way back, but not leaning back, it actually is in its most upright position, I have a tiny bit of legroom left. Now, this seat bottom cushion is definitely slammed to the ground in order to give us a little bit of room back here, but even so, my head is definitely touching the ceiling long before I ever get back there to the headrest. If I want to touch the headrest, you have to kind of crumple into that position. Of course, if you want the most third row room in America, you really ought to be looking at a minivan. I suspect that most folks will have these seats folded most of the time in order to expand the cargo area in the back. There's a little lever over here which I can just barely reach, and these do fold completely flat with that cargo area back there. They even have a separate rug on top so that way your cargo doesn't mess up the back seat. Because of the way that Mazda chose to apportion the space overall in the CX-9, cargo capacity comes in sort of mid-pack at 14.4 cubic feet, even though the CX-9 is one of the longer entries in this segment. The result of the smaller cargo area is that we had difficulties fitting as much roller baggage back here as we could in some of the other large entries. For instance, if I take out this 22-inch roller bag and we were to just put a 24-inch roller bag behind the third row, we'd only be able to fit 1 back here. Now, I was ultimately able to squeeze 2 overall back here, but I did have to remove the cargo area load for it. If you pull this out, then it does drop those 24-inch roller bags just a little bit deeper, and then you can just barely close the lid. Of course, most 3-row crossover owners are going to leave these third row seats folded flat most of the time, and if you do that, then we had no problem fitting 8 of those larger roller bags right back here. In case you're wondering, Mazda does give us a spare tire. It's right there under that final load floor. This is also where you'll find the subwoofer for the audio system. It's built right there into the spare tire holder. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are not in the very top end trim. Instead, we're in one trim down, the Grand Touring model. We have a pretty standard sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads, height adjustable shoulder belts and 2-way adjustable headrests for the driver and front passenger. The model that we're driving features leather upholstery, and unlike the 2016 model we last drove, these seats now offer seat ventilation in the Grand Touring and top end signature trim. Overall materials quality inside the cabin is still very good for this segment. We have a lot of soft touch materials going on the upper sections of the doors. We still do find hard plastics on the lower portions of the door, just as you'd expect out of a mainstream crossover. Moving over to the dashboard, we find soft touch materials for the upper section of the dashboard, and that would be both of those tiers that you see right there on your screen. And then we find hard plastics lower on the dashboard below this aluminum trim that runs across the dashboard. If you opted for the very top end trim, then you would get real wood trim inside this cabin, another differentiation between this and the average mainstream crossover. The glove compartment is one of the bin variety. I was not able to fit a larger tablet computer inside, although something like an iPad mini might fit. In the middle of the dashboard, we find the infotainment screen, and then behind it in our model, we have a center channel speaker. There are two different infotainment screens in the CX-9. There's a smaller 7-inch screen in the base sport trim, and then this larger 8-inch screen in Touring, Grand Touring, and Signature. The larger screen is the only one that comes from the factory with Apple CarPlay integration, but it is our understanding that you can actually add Apple CarPlay to the base 7-inch screen. We're still waiting on confirmation on that, but it does look like that is possible. The addition of Apple CarPlay and Android Auto is a nice touch in this system, and it has improved my overall opinion of it because it does allow us to access things like Google Maps and have this nice satellite imagery there. If I press the home button that I'll show you in a bit down in the center console, we can move on over to the factory interface in the system. You can see the factory navigation interface just isn't quite as snazzy, and then this overall interface is still just a little bit sluggish compared to some of the competition. It does take a while for Apple CarPlay or Android Auto to actually boot up and give you the interface on this screen, but the Mazda CX-9 now has it. Now, it is worth noting this is a touchscreen interface, as you can see right here, but as we see in other Mazda products, you cannot touch the screen once you're in motion. Once you're moving, you actually have to use the rotary controller in the center console. This is a 3-zone automatic climate control system. We turn on and off the rear climate control zone with that button right there. The heated steering wheel function is up here where the heated seat buttons used to be. They've moved the heated seats down here, and then the ventilated seats right down there at the bottom of the button bank. This seat ventilation system is one of the louder ones I've experienced, but I'd rather have a loud seat ventilator than none at all. Continuing on down, we find a large storage cubby right there where you could put smartphones, wallets, keys, that sort of thing, and a pretty typical console shifter. Drive is all the way back like that. Manual mode over to the left. We push away from the driver for down, pull towards the driver for up. It's worth noting that we don't have any paddle shifters on the CX-9. Continuing back behind that, we find the rotary controller for the infotainment system. It's this knob right here, and then these buttons around it. We have a back button, direct access to the media, the home button, nav button, and then a favorites button. You'll find the volume control over here on the right, and then an electric parking brake on the left. The center console opens in a split door fashion. You can open them independently of one another. And in here we find the USB inputs, including the input for the smartphone integration, an SD card slot for the mapping database and auxiliary input, and then a modest amount of storage. It actually is a little bit difficult to fit some of these larger smart devices in there because the storage console is not quite as large as some of the competition. Over on the driver's side, we find a hole in the dashboard because we do have one of the best heads-up displays that you can find in a modern mainstream vehicle, and it's not one of the earlier variety from Mazda where it's projected on a little pop-up sheet of plastic. This actually projects on the windscreen just like we see in luxury cars. The instrument cluster is a partial LCD design like we see in the Mazda 6. We have a physical tachometer on the left and then physical gauge readout over here for fuel level and engine temperature. Everything else is being displayed by this 7-inch LCD right in the middle. Mazda's done a really good job integrating the look with the rest of the instrument cluster, so they've even given us a physical ring sitting right on top of the LCD screen itself, but this instrument cluster is not as configurable as some of the other LCDs we see in modern vehicles. So for instance, you cannot adjust the overall theme of the display, there are no different colors available, etc. It just allows us to choose between the options we've looked at here: status of the vehicle's active safety systems, turn-by-turn navigation directions, trip computer information, etc. The steering wheel is a round design with fairly aggressive sport grips up top, and a nice touch is that it is leather wrapped in all trims of the CX-9, so you don't ever end up with a urethane wheel in this vehicle like we do see in some of the competition. You'll find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control, which is optional, over here on the right, and then the controls for the infotainment system over here on the left. The buttons are a little unusual in that we press in the center for certain functions like info right there and then toggle it around for track forward, backward. Same thing goes for this button module over here, which also contains the voice command option, and then over here on the cruise controls where the middle is the resume button. One thing you won't find on this steering wheel are paddle shifters, as I said before. I really wish that Mazda would add some to the CX-9. It would add a little bit of extra fun. In our acceleration tests, this model went from 0 to 60 in 7.3 seconds. That's just a hair faster than the 2016 model we last tested. The most likely reason for the variance is that it's colder out here right now in California, and that does have an impact on the overall 0 to 60 scores because this engine is likely producing just a little bit more power than it was when it was hotter outside. It could also be that despite Mazda telling us that the last CX-9 arrived with a full tank of premium, that it might have actually had mid-grade or something along those lines, and that may have actually ended up reducing the overall horsepower figure. Remember that when we're talking about the overall horsepower difference between regular and premium unleaded in this vehicle, it's not like a digital on-off switch. It's not like you just have 227 or 250. Modern engines will fiddle with the ignition timing, they'll also fiddle with the valves, and that really results in a sort of a sliding scale from 227 to 250 based on a wide variety of different factors. In our braking tests, this model stopped from 60 miles an hour back to zero in a very short, for this segment, 119 feet. Remember that the CX-9, even though on the inside it's about the same size as a Honda Pilot, on the outside it is actually one of the larger entries. It's also worth noting that overall curb weight in this could actually be higher than some of the competitors as well. The model that we're driving came in right around 4,500 pounds. Before we move on to handling, let's talk a little bit more about this 2.5-liter turbo engine. We have a lot of low-end torque in this engine, so the transmission doesn't really have to shift quite as much as some of the competitions with naturally aspirated V6 engines, and of course we have fewer gears to choose from in this 6-speed as well. Now that does result in a slightly more engaging overall feel to the CX-9, but the overall acceleration figures 0 to 60 times end up lagging behind the competition likely as a result. Passing maneuvers are definitely good in the CX-9 because we have a lot of that low-end power, and this transmission shifts very rapidly. So even though initial 0 to 60 times are a little bit middling in this segment, passing times are actually fairly good. The engine also has a nice punchy feel to it, so it feels a little bit peppier than the numbers would otherwise indicate. On the downside, the CX-9 handles so well that I really wish it had more power, because this is the kind of chassis that could really handle extra thrust. When it comes to overall handling, I'm definitely going to give this an A. This may not have the rear-wheel drive dynamics that we find in the Dodge Durango or the upcoming Ford Explorer, but hands down this is simply one of the best handling front-wheel drive crossovers you can buy, whether we're talking about comparing this to an Acura MDX in the next segment up, or whether we're talking about this cross-shopped with a Honda Pilot. Now the Honda does have a trick up its sleeve if you get the all-wheel drive version, and that is a torque vectoring rear axle, basically the same one that we see in the Acura MDX, and that really does help power on performance in the corners. So in this corner here, if I were to punch this vehicle and turn in, we don't have the same kind of rear-wheel drive feeling that we can get in the Pilot or in the Acura MDX. But in neutral handling situations, the CX-9 I think is superior to both the Honda and the Acura. And regardless of the situation, the overall steering feel in the Mazda is going to be definitely better than what we find in either of those two options. Even though this has electric power steering, we still get a little bit of feedback from the front tires. We don't know exactly what 2020 is going to hold for the base Ford Explorer, but I would suspect that even though that model will be rear-wheel drive and will have those rear-wheel drive dynamics, it may not actually hold the road better than a base version of the CX-9, because again, the CX-9 gets crazy wide tires in the base form. Now they are definitely eco-focused tires, but you can swap them out for regular all seasons or performance all seasons, and you would definitely have a great handling vehicle in this segment. When it comes to the overall ride score for the CX-9, I'm going to give this a C. Remember that this is competing in the mainstream segment, not the luxury segment where we expect more firmly tuned vehicles. The overall suspension tune in the CX-9 is definitely very firm. You'll really notice that when you take a look at the camera feeds, because they're definitely bouncing around a little bit more than most of the mainline competition. Of course, the firmer suspension is one of the reasons that we get such excellent handling in the CX-9, so you have to decide if that trade-off is worth it to you. Now, if you were to compare the CX-9 to some luxury entries like the Acura MDX, for instance, then the overall suspension tune is actually going to be a lot closer. And if you were to somehow move this up into that luxury category, then I would say the overall score would go up to somewhere around a B. Remember that when we're talking about overall scores in this segment, we're always talking about scores as compared to direct competition. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, this vehicle clocked 70.5 decibels, just a hair louder than the last model that we tested. That's likely just due to the overall road surface variations over the last few years. Remember that in the Alex and Auto's cabin noise test, tire noise plays a big role, and because we have those wide tires, we get a little bit more tire noise into the cabin, although wind noise is very well controlled. You'll definitely notice a difference out on a rough road versus a very smooth road. When it comes to overall fuel economy, we've been averaging 21.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. That's pretty good for a vehicle in this segment, but it's not actually the best. In fact, we did average slightly higher overall fuel economy in something like the Nissan Pathfinder. A likely reason for that is the 6-speed automatic transmission. It just doesn't have the same kind of ratio spread that we find in some of the competition's 8 or 9-speed transmissions. That means that when we're out on the highway, the engine is definitely revving a little bit higher than some of the competition and likely dropping the fuel economy that this vehicle could have achieved if it had a different transmission. Mazda is definitely very dedicated to this 6-speed, but personally I think it is time to replace it. In terms of overall real-world fuel economy, the CX-9 is not going to be too far off of many of the competitors. One thing worth noting is that the CX-9 does not have auto start-stop. So if you really dislike auto start-stop, don't worry, this vehicle doesn't have it. But if you don't like turbocharged engines, then you're not going to find a naturally aspirated V6 under this hood. Mazda has continued to price the CX-9 pretty aggressively in this segment. For 2019, it starts at $32,280 for the Sport trim, and the Sport trim is not as decontented as we find in other manufacturers' base models. For instance, we still have 18-inch alloy wheels and those wide 255 width tires, things that we don't even find optional on most of the competition. In addition to that, LED headlamps on the outside are standard, although they don't steer in the base model. The 7-inch infotainment system is standard, although it does not have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and 3-zone automatic climate control will be found on even that base model. One thing that is a little bit surprising about the Mazda lineup, however, is that we don't find full speed range auto brake in the base model, and that is something that we do find in the Honda Pilot and the Toyota Highlander. Mazda does give us their low-speed auto brake package and blind spot monitoring in the base model, but it isn't quite as fully featured as the active safety package we find standard on the Highlander and, of course, on the Honda. I think the best value in the CX-9 lineup is the next step up for the Touring trim at just over $35,000. You get all the features you see on the side of your screen right there, including leather upholstery in the first 2 rows. It's worth noting that the 3rd row, as we see in many crossovers out there, is always imitation leather. You also get Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, the larger infotainment screen, keyless entry, keyless go. This trim also gives you Mazda's adaptive cruise control system, which allows an expanded auto brake setup with pedestrian detection. If you want features like better leather, real wood trim, etc., you will find those in the top-end Signature trim, which costs a little bit less than the top-end trims of many of its direct competitors at just over $45,000. Now let's talk about competition, but before we move right into that, let's take a look at the chart on your screen right here. This is the combined legroom, headroom for the front row, headroom for the middle row, and headroom for the 3rd row. As you can see, although the CX-9 is a full foot longer than many of its direct competitors, the more appropriate way to compare the CX-9 is actually with the Pilot, the Highlander, and the Sorento, rather than something like the Telluride or the upcoming Palisade. Because although the CX-9 is large on the outside, it's actually about the same size as the Highlander or Sorento on the inside. In fact, you'll actually find more combined legroom in the much more compact Sorento than we find in the CX-9. It's important to remember when comparing crossovers to look at combined legroom figures, because the way legroom is measured across the industry does vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, and the most true method of measuring is to actually combine the published front row plus 2nd row plus 3rd row numbers, smush them all together, and that gives you an idea of how much room we actually have in the vehicle. 2nd row seats and 3 row crossovers often move forwards and backwards, as do the front row seats, so that allows you to apportion that space a little bit more equitably across all 3 rows, depending on exactly where you need to put that room. With that out of the way, let's dive into the first and most direct competitor, obviously the Toyota Highlander, the 900-pound gorilla in this segment. At first glance, the Highlander appears to be less expensive than the CX-9. But that's not a comparably equipped model. The CX-9 comes standard with the turbo engine, but the Highlander does not come standard with the V6, unlike some of the competition. You have to option your way up into that. And by the time you've done that, you'll end up more expensive than the base model of CX-9, at around $33,580. In addition to that, key desirable features are also going to cost more in the Highlander than in the CX-9. For instance, if you want leather upholstery in your Highlander, which I think a lot of folks out there do, you will have to pay about $3,000 more for that than the Touring trim of CX-9. And by the time you've worked your way all the way up to the limited Platinum trim, that's going to be about $2,000 more expensive than the very top-end trim of CX-9, and we actually find a few fewer features in that model. The Highlander does excel when it comes to overall reliability and predicted cost of operation, but the CX-9 is unquestionably more fun. I also think it's prettier inside and out, to be perfectly frank. Next up, we have the Honda Pilot. Again, very similar on the inside in terms of overall space to the CX-9. Unlike the Highlander, the base Pilot is actually a pretty good deal, and it is less expensive than the CX-9 at $31,450. Although the Pilot LX does get a number of features removed in order to achieve that low base price, for instance, it doesn't have CarPlay or Android Auto in that particular model, I think overall it actually is still a pretty good deal when compared against the base CX-9. As we see with the Highlander, Honda has put a great deal of active safety technology even into the base trim of the Pilot, and that really does make that a good value if you're seeking out those active safety features. On the other hand, when you start adding content to the Pilot, it becomes less of a good deal compared against the CX-9. For instance, if you want leather in your Pilot, you'll have to pay about $2,000 more than the touring trim of CX-9. Handling comparisons are interesting between the Pilot and the CX-9. The CX-9 is a great handling vehicle, and it really excels when it comes to neutral handling because of those wide tires and a relatively decent weight balance. The Honda Pilot, on the other hand, really comes together when it's power on because it has that ability to torque vector across the rear axle if you choose all-wheel drive. The Honda Pilot is the only entry in this segment to include a mechanical torque vectoring system. And lastly, of course, top-end trims of the Honda Pilot have the ZF 9-speed automatic transmission, which is not as smooth as the 6-speed that we find in lower-end trims of the Pilot or that we find under the hood of the CX-9. Next up, we have the Kia Sorento, which has been a top pick of mine in this segment before. It starts an awful lot less than the CX-9 at $26,290. That's because it has a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine as a base option in that vehicle. Then you have to work your way on up into the 3.3-liter V6. The Sorento is a bit of an odd duck here because some folks out there want to compare the Sorento to the Honda CR-V or the Mazda CX-5 rather than the Pilot or CX-9. But the Sorento on the inside is actually about the same size or larger in some dimensions than the CX-9. We get about 2 inches more legroom in that model than we find in the Mazda, although we get a little bit less cargo room. That's because the Kia has very short overhangs. You'll notice we really don't have any bumper hanging out behind the rear, and the Mazda has a little bit more defined bumpers and has a lot of room up front that is taken up by that very long hood proportion. That's what helps make the CX-9 look so beautiful, but it doesn't end up being terribly space efficient. Also a little bit tricky is the fact that we do have those lower end trims of the Sorento, and formerly it was available as a 2-row or a 3-row crossover, although for 2019 all Sorentos in America are going to be 3 rows. Between these two vehicles, I would say it is definitely a tough call. I really like the Sorento's packaging overall. It's easier to park than the CX-9 because it's about a foot shorter, but you don't actually give up any interior room as a result of the vehicle becoming smaller overall. We have a much shorter hood in the Kia, and then we have that much stubbier rear end in the back. Kia's long warranty is definitely going to be a big deal for some. In terms of overall reliability, the Sorento has also proven to be a little bit more reliable than the CX-9. And lastly, we have the comparison that so many of you wanted us to make on Facebook, CX-9 versus Acura MDX. This is a comparison that I have tried to resist because they're two sort of different vehicles. One is a more luxury-oriented vehicle. The MDX may start about the same price as the CX-9 tops out, but it goes much higher because it's designed to compete with the Audi Q7, be a value alternative to something like the previous generation BMW X5, definitely the Volvo XC90, etc. It just doesn't play in the same pool as the Mazda CX-9. But then on the other hand, Acura does not have the same kind of brand recognition that we see in the European luxury brands like BMW and Mercedes and Audi. So Acura is definitely somewhere in this nebulous region in the middle, also where we see brands like Buick and their Enclave. So rather than make a direct comparison, let's talk about what you get when you upgrade from the CX-9 into the MDX, and more importantly, what you lose. For $44,300, you could buy yourself a base MDX front-wheel drive vehicle. It will have leather upholstery, but it won't have all the same kind of features and gadgets and goodies that we find on the top-end signature trim of the CX-9. Front seat comfort is one of the big things you'll notice when you compare the CX-9 Signature against more full-on luxury brands out there. Although the MDX again falls somewhere in the middle. I find the front passenger seat in the MDX more comfortable than what we see in the CX-9, but it's still not as adjustable as the driver's seat. You won't get that kind of functionality until you move up into the next category where we see BMW, Mercedes, Volvo, etc. playing. For instance, if you were to compare the CX-9 to the XC90, the XC90 is going to have a considerably more comfortable front passenger seat. It's going to be just as adjustable as the driver's seat. You're going to be able to get available front seat massage, etc., things that you don't find in the Mazda. But that's going to be considerably more expensive. In terms of overall driving dynamics, the MDX does feel more nimble, again thanks to the super handling all-wheel drive system that it basically shares with the Honda Pilot. But on the flip side, the 9-speed automatic transmission is found under the hood of the MDX, and there's no way to avoid it in that model like you can avoid it in the Honda Pilot. Obviously, there's going to be a different brand experience. There's going to be that Acura logo on the hood, which is going to indicate that you paid more for the vehicle. But when it comes to overall looks, I have to say, I think that the Mazda CX-9 is actually just a hair prettier than the current generation MDX. It's also worth noting that it's actually a little bit roomier on the inside as well. And then there are the things that you have to give up in order to move up into that Acura model. You have to give up the real wood trim, the heated steering wheel, the Napa leather seats with ventilation that we find in that top-end CX-9 model, the navigation software on the infotainment system, the 360-degree camera, and all the other things that you see on your screen. To bottom line this segment, I'm actually going to declare a tie between the Kia Sorento and the CX-9. I like a lot of things about the Sorento. I like its overall lower price tag if you're targeting the absolute value entry. I like its longer warranty, and I like the more comfortable driver's seat if you're looking at the top-end trim. That is a pretty big deal for me. But on the other hand, again, the CX-9 is awfully attractive. Let me know what you would pick if you were shopping in this segment. Be sure and comment down there in the comment section down below. If you haven't found us at facebook.com, click on over there so you can see what we're driving this week. Click up to the top of your screen if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do, and I'll see you next week.